Hey, before we get started today, I want to give Emma Jane Phillips a shout out. She was over here on the keyboard for the first time. We gave Danny Conley a couple weeks off for fall break, and she jumped in 12 years old. So I don't know, I don't remember what I was doing at 12 years old, but it wasn't that. I can assure you. So I heard a story recently about two businessmen who crashed their private plane onto a tiny South Pacific island. Now, thankfully, they both survived the crash, and one of the guys decided after the smoke cleared that he was going to go explore the island and try to find help or at least find some supplies that might increase their chances of survival. He came back several hours later in a state of near panic, and he told his traveling partner, "We're in big trouble. I've walked all over the island. There's no food. There's no water. There's no people. It looks like we're going to die." His business partner was casually leaned back against the wreckage, and without missing a beat, he said, "We're not going to die." He said, "I make $250,000 a week." Now, that seemed like a strange comment in response to what he just heard. So his friend got right in his face. He said, "Did you not hear what I said? We're on an uninhabited island. There's no food. There's no water. We're going to die." Again, his friend said, "Relax. We're not going to die. I make $250,000 a week." He couldn't believe the arrogance of his longtime business partner. So he said it a third time. He said, "Look, we're going to die this slow, horrible death." And finally his friend interrupted him. He said, "Stop." He said, "Don't make me explain this again. I make $250,000 a week. I also give 10% of everything I make to my church. So if somebody else doesn't find us, my preacher's definitely going to find us." Now, that's kind of an old one, but it's funny because it's true. You know what I mean? So this morning, we're kicking off a brand new series we're calling The Journey to Generosity. If you have your Bible, I want you to turn to Luke chapter 12. And I know, whenever the church talks about money, everybody gets nervous, and there's this assumption that most people think like the reason we're talking about this is because we want you to give more of your hard-earned money to us. And while that's not completely untrue, I want to tell you up front that for the next 2 or 3 weeks, what we're going to talk about is going to go a lot deeper than that. Rather than focusing on what you give in the offering or these random acts of generosity, last week we had this incredible offering, nearly $5,000 for hurricane victims. Rather than talking about what we want you to do, we want to talk about who we want you to be and who the Bible talks about who all of us should be. And that's somebody who doesn't just do occasionally generous things, but who is actually a generous person. And sometimes those are two different things. So I want you to rest assured as we jump into this, we're not just talking about giving, we're talking about a lot more than that. And as we jump in this morning, I want to show you something that I think explains why a lot of us struggle with generosity. And just to give you sort of a spoiler alert, it's not because of the numbers. For most of us, our struggles with generosity are not because of our financial situation. It's because of the mindset in which we view our financial situation. So I want to show you something. I call it the crazy train. We're going to put it on the screen. You've got a copy of it in your bulletin if you want to look at it, if you want to fill in the blanks. You may have never thought about it in exactly these terms, but for a lot of us, this kind of explains our lives. This is kind of the cycle that a lot of us have spent most of our lives on. At the top of the cycle, you see the word worry. So who worries about money? Well, everybody worries about money. CNBC, the business website, highlighted a survey just a couple weeks ago. They found that 90% of Americans now admit that their financial situation is negatively impacting their health, their stress level. And just as a side note, family therapists will tell you that the topic of money, like who spends it, who makes it, who overspends it, who keeps track of it, is one of the leading causes of divorces in most families. In this survey that CNBC highlighted, they said 65% of Americans now say that their financial problems have reached a level that they don't see any way it'll ever get better. 50% said that they wish they could somehow experience a financial fresh start, and roughly 45% freely admitted that they are taking no positive steps to ensure their financial future. Something else that was interesting about the survey they highlighted, though, is that it didn't seem to matter how much money a person made or how much money a person had already accumulated, they still were worried about money. Those on the lower end of the income scale were worried about how to make more money in the future. Those who already made a lot of money were worried about how to make even more money in the future and how to secure what money they had already accumulated. So it was interesting. It didn't seem to matter like how many zeros you added to the bank statement. Everybody was still worried about money. Now, if you find yourself in that 10% of people who aren't so worried about it, then you're blessed. But most of us here know that this is something we worry about. And some of you are at a stage of life where you're now making more money than you ever thought possible, and yet when you go down to sleep at night, you're still worried about money. The next step in the cycle that you see is the word spending. This is hard to explain. It makes no sense from a logical perspective, and yet a lot of us do it. For some of us, it's our worries about money that prompt us to spend more money in hopes of making ourselves feel better. Counselors call it retail therapy, and here's how it works. You go through the end of the month, and you're checking out your credit card statement, and you're looking at your bank statement, and the numbers don't look real good, right? The math doesn't seem to be working out. And so you try to put that aside, and you pull out your phone, and you immediately start scrolling Amazon, looking for that can't-miss deal of the day. And so what happens is you wind up spending more money because you're worried about money. And a lot of us do it. Some of us have got the receipts, like you go home and you got more boxes on your porch, like it's taller than you are. You know what I'm saying? You're like, this can't be good. It makes no logical sense, and yet a lot of us struggle with it. And then what happens is that leads us to the third thing you see in this cycle, and that's debt. It's like we run out of money to spend, and so we go borrow money in hopes of spending more money, which, of course, just starts the cycle all over again. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York 2 weeks ago released a study that found that the average American now has $104,215 in debt. It's in mortgages, credit cards, vehicles, and student loans. And now some of you hear that and you think, man, $104,000 in debt, like that sounds crazy. I'm glad I'm not carrying that. Others of you hear that and think $104,000 in debt, like that sounds pretty good. And you think that would be awesome. Keep in mind, like that's the average. So that includes the people that don't have any debt, which means there's a lot of people carrying around $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, $600,000 in debt. And they don't see any light at the end of that tunnel, and so they borrow more to spend more, and they worry more. And it's like this vicious cycle, this roller coaster, this crazy train that so many people live on that wreaks havoc in a lot of different areas of our lives. And I think that's the reason Jesus talks so much about money and about possessions. Even though it makes some of us uncomfortable, when you go back and read through the New Testament, it surprises people to discover that Jesus talked more about money and how you handle your possessions than he did any other topic, including heaven and hell. If you go back and just count the parables, 16 of the 38 parables, or 42% of the stories that Jesus told were directly related to money and possessions. And the reason he did that is because Jesus understood instinctively that how we handle our money is about more than how we handle our money. It's about the type of person that we're becoming and whether or not we're giving our heart to him. So one of the most famous stories that Jesus told about money is found in Luke chapter 12. It's a story about a person that most of us know. Some of us have been at different points in our lives. And before we look at the story, though, there's one detail that's easy to miss that comes right before the story that changes the way you understand the story when you finally get to the story. So you go back to Luke chapter 12, verse 1. Here's the way Luke sort of sets the scene. He says, "Meanwhile, when a crowd of many thousands had gathered so that they were trampling on one another, Jesus began to speak first to his disciples, saying, 'Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Now, I want you to just catch this with me. So by this point in his ministry, Jesus is drawing these huge crowds everywhere he goes. And Luke tells us he's out there in the fields. There's people like stacked up on top of one another. And yet, rather than speaking to the crowd, Jesus shifts his attention and his focus, and he speaks first to his disciples, the people who are closest to him. It's almost as if Jesus knew that what he was about to say was going to be so different from what most people believed. Like, he knew that most people are going to hear what I've said. They're going to think, like, this is crazy talk. And so he started with those who were closest to him, who knew him best, and he just sort of let everybody else listen in. I think that's especially true of what he has to say about how we view our possessions and how we handle our money. Jesus knew that most people, and you don't have to look far to find examples of this, most people in our culture are so caught up in this, uncontrolled anxiety fueled by, unrestrained spending and just excessive borrowing. Some people have gotten so used to that. Like, that's become so normal that whenever you hear something else, it sounds like it's impossible. And so Jesus looks at his disciples and he says, here's some things I want you to know. And he's going to let everybody else listen in. And then you get to verse 13, and there's this guy in the crowd who interrupts Jesus' sort of private time with his disciples, and he asks Jesus a question. Verse 13, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now, some of you experience this. Nothing brings people together like a death in the family, right? I mean, this guy, we don't know what the issue is, but we do know that in the first century, they didn't have like civil judges like we do. And so what they would do, they would invite these rabbis, especially these traveling rabbis, to sort of arbitrate the disagreement. But what's so interesting about this is rather than getting involved in their family drama, Jesus responds by giving them a warning about something that affects all of us. Verse 14, Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." What is it that causes us to spend money we don't have to buy things we don't really need? Almost always, it's greed. And what is greed? It's this insatiable desire for more. Greed is the thing that no matter how much you have, convinces you that it's not enough and what you really need is more. Greed is the thing that no matter how many zeros get added to your bank statement or how many investment accounts have your name on them, convinces you that what you really need is more. Greed is what caused John Rockefeller, the owner of the Standard Oil Company, one of the richest men in history. In an interview, he was asked, "How much money does it take to make a person happy?" And his answer was, "Just a little bit more." That's what greed does. And it affects all of us. And so Jesus says that we need to be on our guard. Greed is what keeps the goalposts moving. It's what keeps us from ever feeling financially secure. And it's not because we don't have enough. For most of us, it's because what we really want is more than enough. So it was at that point that Jesus issues this warning. He then launches into a story about a guy that, some of us know and some of us have been, and you can probably relate to. Verse 16, "And he told them this parable, the ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? And this is how it will be with whoever stores up for themselves, but is not rich toward God. One of the things that makes this story so startling is that the guy that Jesus described accomplished what most of us are striving for. Like you get to verse 16, Jesus tells us this dude was already a rich man. He was already someone who was financially stable and secure, but now because of this huge harvest, he stands to become even richer. So now rather than just having enough or even more than enough, he's now going to have way more than enough, which is what all of us want, right? Like it's one thing to be rich, right? But how much better would it be to be like super rich? And that's where the guy in this story is. He's not just rich, man. He's getting ready to become super rich. But as successful as he was, there's one sort of tragic miscalculation that he makes that turns out to be his undoing. And that's that at some point in his story, at some point in his life, he started to view himself as the owner of everything he had, rather than as the manager or the steward of what God had given him. So here's the big idea if you're tracking with us. I want to spend a few minutes thinking about it. It's that if we want to get off the crazy train, we have to learn to think like a manager and not an owner. Think like a manager and not an owner. So you go back to verse 17. The farmer in this story, he asked the right question. He said, what should I do? I've got all this stuff. What shall I do? His problem was that he came up with the wrong answer. He asked the right question but answered it wrongly. And so here's his plan. I've already got enough. In fact, I've got like more than enough. So here's what I'll do. I'll spend a little of what I have so that I can keep even more, so that I can have way more than enough. So I'll tear down the barns, I'll build bigger barns, and then I'll finally feel secure. And keep in mind, this dude was already rich. Like, this was not a question of whether or not he was financially secure. He was already rich. It wasn't like he needed more to be secure. It was just that he did not want to let go of anything that God had given him. For some reason, he fell in the same trap that a lot of us have fallen into, and he started to view himself as the owner instead of the manager. And that's why I said earlier, for most of us, our struggle with generosity is not about the numbers. It's almost always about the lens through which we view the numbers. For most people, their struggle against generosity is not what's written on the paper. It's what's going through their mind when they look at what's written on the paper. See, if you see yourself as the owner, then you're going to do whatever it takes to hold on to what you have and maybe even go to absurd lengths to get more. But if you're a manager, then rather than obsessing over how much you have and how much you can give, you start to be more interested in investing what you've been given in the things that are closest to the owner's heart. And that's a totally different mindset. Here's something that may help illustrate. I've got a picture I want to show you. Back in May, graduates of the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth campus were shocked when their commencement speaker, Robert Hale, who you see, he's got these two envelopes in his hand. He was the commencement speaker. When commencement was over, they would hand everybody their diploma. Then they would walk by him, and he would hand every graduate, 1,200 graduates, 2 different envelopes. And in each of those envelopes was $500 in cash. Now, Mr. Hale is a CEO and founder of a large telecommunications company. He was in Forbes magazine just a couple years ago. He and his wife committed to give $1 million a week to different nonprofits in their area. Of course, he's a billionaire, so he could do that. Most of us can't do that. But he goes to commencement. He hands every graduate 2 envelopes, $500 in each envelope. Here was the instruction. The first envelope with $500 is a gift to you. We want to honor you for graduating. You can do whatever you want. The second envelope, though, we want you to take the second $500 and give it to either an organization or a person that needs it more than you do. And so every graduate, 1,200 graduates, walked out carrying $1,000 in cash. Now, you know this is what happened. Most people were excited, but there were at least a few graduates who went home that day. And what were they doing? They were complaining that they were expected to give half of what they've been given away. And the reason I know that's true is because that's what all of us do, right? And we forget, like if the guy hadn't given us 2 envelopes to start with, we wouldn't have anything. So it was never really ours to begin with. We were never really the owner. We were just the manager of what we've been given. It's the same thing we do in our relationship with God. God gives each of us a limited amount of resources, and he says, I want you to give some of what I've given you to benefit other people. And what do? We start complaining, forgetting that if he hadn't given it to us in the first place, we wouldn't have it to give. And so how do you learn to break that mindset? How do you learn to think like a manager instead of an owner? There's 3 things in the story. First, you have to assume accountability. As you look at this parable, the mistake that eventually led to the rich man's undoing was that he forgot that, like, ultimately, all of us answer to somebody. And just look at the language. Go back in the passage. Look at the language this guy uses. He says, what shall I do? This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones where I will store my grain. And you get to my favorite part. He says, then I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. I mean, if you ever want to see a picture of a guy that was like all wrapped up in himself, this is it. 12 times in just 3 verses, he uses some variation of I, mine, or you. He's talking to himself. I mean, this is a guy, his entire focus is on himself and what he can do to make his life better. And that's the way you think when you see yourself as the owner. It's all about you. But this man forgot the same thing that a lot of us forget, and that's that eventually the rightful owner shows up and demands an accounting. Just a side note, of all the parables Jesus told, this is the only one in which God actually says something. And what he says should be enough to send a chill up every spine. Verse 20. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? Now, in our culture, we would call this guy success. Now, here's this rich guy who's now going to be super rich. And yet, when God called him something, he called him a fool. And in Scripture, the word fool always indicates a person who's out of touch with reality, specifically the reality about God. Psalm 14:1, David says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. You know what the most foolish thing you can do is? Is to live your life as if God doesn't exist. And yet so many of us do that, especially when it comes to our finances. And we make our financial decisions as if God's not really a part of the equation. And we would never say like we don't believe in God. It's just that we kind of operate like he doesn't exist, and that we'll never stand before him and give an account for how we lived and for what we did with what he gave us. And so the first step in learning to think like a manager is to acknowledge that someday each of us will give an accounting to the owner. Now here's the second thing you see. You have to assume accountability. You also have to avoid comparisons. And here's what I mean by that. One of the things that always stands out to me when I read this story is that it wasn't enough for this guy just to be rich. Like, he wanted to be richer. And it wasn't enough for him to have a big barn. Like, he wanted to have a bigger barn. One writer I read called this the land of Ur. And it is a neighborhood where a lot of us would like to live. Here's what I mean. It's not enough like just to have a nice house. You want to have a nicer house. Nicer than whose? Well, nicer than everybody else's. Who's this guy wanted bigger barns. Bigger than whose? Bigger than all the neighbors. It's not enough to have like a new car, right? You want to have a newer car. It's It's not enough to have a big boat. You want to have a bigger boat. And that works okay until there comes out the new model, and then there's a nicer, newer, bigger, faster, whatever it is, and you have to have. The problem with that, though, is if you live in the land of Ur too long, you eventually wind up in another place that's even darker, and it's called the land of Est. And so now, it's not enough to have a bigger barn. I've got to have the biggest barn. And maybe I've got to have a whole row of the biggest barns. And it's not enough just to have like the nicer car. I've got to have the nicest car. Or maybe a whole garage full of the nicest cars. And the problem with all of this, and you know where this is going, the problem with all of this is there's always somebody that has more than you do. Like, no matter where you look, no matter how rich you are, there's always somebody that's richer than you are and has nicer stuff than you do, which prevents you from being the richest and having the nicest. And so Morgan Housel, in his great book, The Psychology of Money, said it this way. He said, the hardest financial skill to learn is getting the goalposts to stop moving. The point is that the ceiling of social comparison is so high that virtually no one will ever hit it. Which means it's a battle that can never be won. Or that the only way to win is not to fight to begin with, to accept that you might have enough, even if it's less than those around you. Now, there's one more thing you see in this passage, and it's so important. So you assume accountability, you avoid comparison, and then at some point you start to invest eternally. If you get to verse 20, as I said, God steps back into this story, and he drives home the point that every person's life comes with an expiration date. And when that expiration date comes, everything you've spent your life building, accumulating, investing, at that very moment you take your last breath, that's going to become somebody else's. That's just how it works. And I know it's cliche, but it's true. Like, you can't take any of it with you. You just can't. And so you get down to verse 21. I want you to listen to how Jesus ends this story. He says, this is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. This is an amazing story. We think 5 or 6 verses. Jesus perfectly summarizes how most people live their lives. We spend our limited amount of time. What do? We build, we earn, we accumulate in hopes that someday we'll have enough so we can kick back, take life easy and eat, drink, and be merry, and exactly what this guy in the story wants to do. And then what happens is you die. I love the way John Ortberg, one of my favorite writers, put this in a book. He said, people go through life, get stuff, and then they die, leaving all their stuff behind. What happens to it? The kids argue over it. The kids who haven't died yet, who are really just pre-dead people, go over to their parents' house. They pick through their parents' old stuff like vultures, deciding which stuff they want to take to their houses. And they say to themselves, now this is my stuff. And then they die, and some new vultures come. Aren't you glad you came to church today? Like, that's so encouraging. But in the middle of painting like this incredibly grim picture that is accurate, Jesus also says there is another way you can live. You don't have to spend your life storing up treasures for yourselves that will someday become somebody else's problem. Instead, he says you can be rich toward God. So make sure you understand, the mistake this guy made was not that he was rich. It was not that he was successful. Now I know, like in our culture, there's a certain segment of the population that's suspicious of anybody that's successful or anything that's successful. That's not what this is about. This guy's problem was not that he was successful. In fact, in other places of Scripture, it seems to indicate that you're supposed to do the best you can with what you've been given. So success is kind of something we're all aiming for. It's not that. His problem was that he was selfish. Like, it's okay to be successful. In fact, it's good to be successful. But it's not okay to be selfish. And that's a big difference. I got one last picture I want to show you. Just a week ago, Forbes magazine released their Forbes 400 list, in which they bill this as the definitive list of the richest Americans. At the top of the list, you have the usual suspects: Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Warren Buffett, names that you would recognize. Oddly enough, I read through the entire list twice, and I didn't see my name. But I didn't see your name either, so just be clear on that. But I did see her name. That is Tamara Gustafson. She came in at 118th on the list. Her net worth, they estimate to be somewhere between $9 and $10 billion. Her primary source of income is that she is the majority shareholder of a company called Public Storage that was founded by her father, B. Wayne Hughes, back in 1972. So just as a side note, her entire family are all billionaires because they store the stuff that we don't use anymore, and most people have forgotten they even had, just so you know. She also owns a horse farm in Lexington, has been the home to several Kentucky Derby winners. According to Forbes magazine, she is the richest person in the state of Kentucky. Now, honestly, the Forbes 400 list is a list that most of us probably have no chance of ever being on. But there's another list that Jesus said is infinitely more important, because it's the one list that carries over into eternity. See, at some point, Tamara Gustafson is going to pass, and all that she's built up is going to go to somebody else. But there's one list that you can be on that you do actually get to take with you into eternity, and it's the list of people who are rich toward God. And so I want to ask you, which list are you trying to get on? Because one, you're probably not going to make. The other one's free. All you have to do is accept what he did for me. If you want to see what generosity looks like, you look at the cross. You look at what Jesus did for you. And then you say, I'm going to live my life in response to what he did so that I can be rich toward God, and I can build up, no matter what my earthly life looks like, I can build up this eternity that I'm going to spend with him because of what he did. It's the greatest deal going. Not only does he pay like your entrance fee, he pays your monthly installments. He's the one that keeps you in the family if you accept what he did for you. So I want you to stand with me. We're going to sing a couple songs, and if you're here and you need to pray with somebody, you need to talk to somebody, maybe you're ready to take that step of baptism, as John said, had some folks do that. We had a lot of folks do that over the last few weeks. We'd be honored to help you do that. Maybe you have questions about where you land in all this. David's here. He's great at answering questions. He'd love to talk with you. We'd love to pray with you. For some of you, quite honestly, like the thing you may need to do is not so much like a public thing, but it's a private thing. Maybe some of you feel like the thing you need to do is write a check to somebody or give to something that you've been hoarding for yourself, that somebody that needs it more than you do. Sometimes that's the way it works, as painful as it can sometimes be. So we're going to sing this song, and if you need to pray with somebody, talk to somebody, you have something you need to do, I'm going to ask you to leave your seat and meet me on this front row, and we'll be glad to try and help you.